There are lots of different things that affect biodiversity. The ability of an ecosystem to maintain a diverse forms of life. Population ecology is how scientists use models in order to explain the events that are going on and how populations exist or coexist in their environment. So, in order to understand that, we got to know what a population is. Well, it's just a group of organisms. They're usually all the same species, and they live in the same place or the same vicinity of each other. These penguins are a population. They're living in the same relative area. Well, in fact, the picture shows that they're very close to each other, and they're living on the same space, the same place. Even though penguins can exist in a lot of different regional areas, this group is a population because they're interacting all together. So, one way to explain population density or to illustrate it, to model it, is by measuring the number of individuals that are living in a defined space. This can be affected by lots of things like their birth rates, their death rates, how many individuals are coming in or out of the population, which are immigrating in or immigrating out. These will all cause the population density to be different. We say a population has a high density if the individuals are numerous and they're closer together, and it has a low density or low population density if fewer individuals are further apart. Organisms will form strategies to survive as a population in their environment. One way that we can illustrate this or model it is graphically, mathematically. So we use survivorship curves to explain or demonstrate the number of individuals that are in a population and the strategy that they're using to survive. So there's three basic types: type 1, type 2, type 3. Type 1 organisms, they have a very heavy amount of parental care. As you can see from the diagram here, that type 1 organisms, as they age, they have a very high survivorship. And then they reach a certain age and they just start to die off very quickly. That's an example of humans, right? We have a lot of parental care that goes into our offspring, and we live a pretty good the longevity's there, but then we just drop off. There's type 2. Type 2 is a strategy of individuals. A lot of birds use this strategy where, their offspring, they have a high number of offspring. And a bird can have a full nest, but not all of those individuals are going to make it to reproductive years. In fact, they drop off very linearly. If we have 12 eggs, as the bird starts to age, they die at all these different ages, just due to predation or a variety of other factors, environmental factors. So birds are very classic type 2 strategist survivors. And, the mortality rate is really not affected by age. It's more affected by, the environment or looking for food or just being preyed upon. And then we have type 3 organisms. Type 3 organisms, they have a lot of offspring. They produce a lot of gametes, they have a lot of early offspring, and then a lot of them are produced, and then apparently most of those offspring are food. So before they reach a certain age right here, they drop off rapidly. A lot of offspring is lost to predation. Squids, are a good example of this. They have lots of offspring in the ocean, but a lot of them end up as food. And then, a few individuals, as they continue to age, survive to produce a lot of individuals. So they have an early loss, a large loss, and they have produced a lot of offspring, but many of them die right away, and few of them survive to be reproductive adults. How organisms disperse themselves is another model on population. So dispersion is the spatial distribution of organisms in a population. You can think of it as a random distribution, a more uniform distribution. Sometimes you'll hear it called even. It's not the best word, but a uniform distribution. And then, of course, a clumped distribution. So Things that are dispersed randomly by chance, just by growth, can you think of anything? I'll come back to it. How about things that are more uniform, like just they're in a line and they're organisms that are dispersed like this? What about, I always think of like Christmas trees, as they're growing. Uh, Trees, well, they need a certain amount of water, they need a certain amount of root space, so they're going to take up a certain land, almost in a complete uh, circle radiating from a certain distance of the actual tree. So if you look at a forest carefully, and if you look at just the oak trees, if I take away everything besides the oak trees, now you'll see that each oak tree needs a certain amount of space for its roots to grow and to uptake water. And so they'll form this very nice, even, uniform distribution in a forest. Things that are clumped, like prairie dogs, you know what those are? Prairie dogs, they live in families, and so they tend to be clumped, grouped together. They can have a smaller clump or even a larger clump, but they live in families or large density populations are very, very close together. So the dispersion of prairie dogs is there's a lot of distance between family sets or groups of organisms. All right, now that you can make sense of a uniform and a clump distribution, it's a little easier to see what it means to be dispersed randomly. So when I think of random, I think of those dandelion flowers, they have the white puffy part. And when they come up out of the ground, you can blow them and their seeds just, fly off into the air. Those seeds will disperse randomly based on air currents, or the direction in which the wind's blowing when they're actually released. And so wherever the seed falls, that's where the next dandelion's going to grow. Bacteria can be dispersed randomly in a situation. So a lot of things will grow in random distribution. Not too many animals per se, although that they can. Animals have more preferences. They're more complicated than that. They're just not going to randomly be somewhere. But the random distribution with a lot of organisms that were, that original type 3 survivorship curve, definitely be randomly distributed. Populations can also grow at 2 different rates. We call those exponential or logistic. So an exponential growth rate curve usually starts off, just moving along here. We just have a very, very stable population, and then all of a sudden there's this big boom in distribution. So we can see humans here. There, for a long time, we had a population that was relatively stable, and then we hit the Industrial Revolution and better medical care, and then we just exponentially grew. But this population grows without limit per se. We all know that there is some sort of limit, but like I said, it's just a model. It's a model that scientists use to explain, populations. They can also be more logistic. So they grow the same at first. They do this stable, smaller population. They have an exponential growth. But then once they reach a certain population size, wherever that is, they start to level off. This means that the logistical growth has reached what's called the carrying capacity. That's just like the theoretical maximum growth. It's some sort of mathematical point of a population size, because I should probably say there's a population size right here, that the environment has that can support a certain number of individuals. So, a lot of things do come up to a carrying capacity. If you think about most natural populations, like fish, for example, if we're talking about a lake, there's only so many fish that one lake can handle, that can support, a population of fish. And so it's going to reach some sort of carrying capacity eventually. Most things reach some sort of carrying capacity. Population growth is not exponential in any form of the imagination. There are limiting factors, and these are things where that they limit the size that the population can reach. A lot of times it's an environmental factor or a resource factor, but these limiting factors can come in varieties. They can be living, biotic, or non-living, abiotic. Can you think of any examples that can be living examples that would limit how much a population can grow? What about a non-living example? These limiting factors, they can also be classified as density dependent or density independent. So what that means is that if it's density dependent, the size of the actual population is dependent upon that limiting factor. If it's density independent, if it's a factor that's completely independent of the population size, those things we just say are more like chance. So a density independent factor that would limit population growth are things like a volcanic eruption. If the population of bunny rabbits is 100 and then a volcano erupts, kills half of them and they're down to 50, then that is a density independent population limiting factor. But things that can be dependent are like food source. So if that 100 group, that population of 100 bunnies, there's only enough dandelions growing on a small island to support, 75 bunnies, then when the population overshoots that carrying capacity, it's going to cause death and it's going to bring the bunnies back down to 75. So that is an example of a density dependent factor, limiting factor in a population. The bunny rabbits are kind of dependent upon, their population size is dependent upon the food source that's there. So the outcome of these dependent factors, these limiting factors, really depends on population size. Things that are density dependent, they have a larger impact on more dense populations because these are factors that aren't triggered by, an increase in population size like crowding and food consumption. Other things are like competition, or if things are being preyed upon, or if there's disease or parasites. And then limiting factors that are density independent, they're more regulated by population regardless of where density or size or even distribution, really. So nearly all species in an ecosystem are affected equally by these density independent limiting factors. Like we talked about before, things that occur by chance. So anything in weather, or if there's been some sort of pollution or natural disaster.